his own presentation. Dr. Mbodj.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Professor Cochran, for your presentation. Just to piggyback on what you just said, it seems to be that the Dara is being reinvented in a way because the traditional way of conquering rural space was definitely, yes, the um, spiritual side, the organizational side of the brotherhood, and it's kind of an, let's say, objective to be present in rural areas where definitely uh, uh, the Dara were the weapon to be able to achieve that. And I will come back to it a little bit later. But most of the time when we look at the Dara, we're actually looking at it as a factor of expansion. Most of the literature about Dara is about the Murid transporting themselves into areas where they were not originally welcomed, or just they were not originally from. And in a way, it was always seen as some kind of an conquering the land. Now I'm putting qualifiers in terms of conquering. We're not talking about any kind of an, physical confrontation, but it's more about clearing the land and putting it under cultivation. Sometime having problems with the neighborhood, the previously established communities, but at the end, it will end up being a kind of a good type of cooperative relationship between the Taliban Murid and the surrounding communities. But the type of Dara that Professor Cochran is talking about is more restructuring all the spaces that for over 100 years are already under Muridism. So it seems to be a kind of a reshaping the old terroir, as we call it in our jargon, in order to answer the new needs. And this is fascinating in a way. First of all, it shows that there is growth, and where there is growth, there is evolution, and where there is evolution, there is adaptation. It's obvious that 60, 50 years ago, the focus was to produce, to monetize the product, to stabilize populations, and to root them into Muridism. I think that Muridism is at no risk of losing its people. So the rootedness is more about the spirituality than actually to recruit Murids. So that therefore the new Dara are not recruiting tools; they are actually consolidating the ethos of being Murid. The second aspect of the new Dara that you're illustrating is to take into account new questions, environment. Obviously, for the last 60 years or so, the Western Sahel, including Senegal, had been beset by cycles of drought, mainly because of loss of vegetation. And the Murid under the colonial era had been accused of many of the depredations. And actually, in the area that I know a little bit more, the Sin Salum, they have been literally accused of destroying the forest and literally creating pockets of drought, which later on in the 1960s, 1970s extended to almost most of the western part of Senegal. So now that the Murid are rebuilding the environment, planting trees, irrigating, because traditionally, again, we talk about slash and burn type of agriculture. Therefore, now when you have when you bring it back, irrigation, that's a new dimension. So this new Dara is taking into account the new environment, an environment where a loss of vegetation means drought, a loss of uh, water uh, uh, precipitations mean threat to the well-being of the populations. And the third and last is the well-being of students. The traditional daras in the 19 from the 1900, I mean actually even before the 1900, up to the 1960s, 70s, was mostly, uh, let's say, adolescent and older ado adolescents and young adults. Now we talk about taking care of children, literally, from an early age and growing them up into the Muridia system and making them part of the system through education, and education that is taking into account what you will call the sedentarity, the necessity to have a pedagogy that is rooted in Muridism. So the practice is not focused just on practicing Islam, the five pillars, and so on and so forth. It is more about rediscovering the Muridiya and learning the text, for instance, instead of just singing the Hasaid, now to understand what they mean and to draw lessons from what they say and to implement it into their own life. So therefore, those children that are being taught today into Muridism are much more aware of what you will call the spiritual side and the pedagogical side of the brotherhood that may be 60 or 80 or 90 years ago, where basically it was more about clearing the forest to establish communities around the Dara, and around the Dara to establish villages and to create a string of villages that communicate with each other, and at the end allow for the front pionnier, as we call it, to move into new quarters, new areas, and the next generation will move a little bit further into those areas. Now we have this kind of an staying steady where you are and deepening the roots into Muridism, but also creating opportunities to adapt to the new environment, but also creating educational opportunities actually to branch out to new type of activities that are not just limited to agriculture. And that is very important to notice. So this will be my take on Professor Cochrane's presentation. Now, if time allows me, maybe
maybe 5 more minutes. Maybe 5 more
okay,
minutes.
five more minutes. My own experience in looking at the Muridiya, and especially following the thread of the Dara, which seems to be quite appropriate at this time, is first of all, and I think I've already described it. It's more often agricultural entrepreneurship into areas that were not traditionally Murid. We talk about the Central Saloum, we talk about the Eastern Saloum, from Gossas to Kafrin, and from there the Terre-Neuve, Koungheul, and branching out into the Gambia, the source of the Gambia, La Haute Gambie, as they say, Upper Gambia River. This is the kind of a trajectory that I have studied, and the railroad was quite, which was built not for the Murid, but the Murid were probably the one who understood the more the opportunities offered by the railroad. So they established communities radiating from the railroad into, especially the Saloum, into Eastern Baol, of course, where it is a kind of a starting point. Central Baol was already well occupied, well controlled, if you want to put it that way, by the Brotherhood. So it was more about Eastern Baol, and then Northern Saloum, and then Central Saloum, and then Eastern Saloum, and as I said, the Upper Gambia River area, the Terre-Neuve, as they call it, without getting into more detail. including, of course, encroaching upon the Haute Casamance, the Upper Casamance area too. So those dara were definitely agricultural endeavors that brought young men who were already strong enough to participate in agricultural endeavors. Very few children. Usually children will be sent back into communities of uncles, parents, and other type of dara, and then will come back to reconnect with their original communities, especially after the age of 15, 16, where they will be strong enough to participate into agricultural endeavors. That community was so dynamic that the French administration was torn into two issues. It is absolutely clear that the influx of Mouride in that area explained why the output of groundnut more than tripled between the 1890s to the 1930s. There's no doubt about that. And they were quite happy with it. But on the other hand, they were unhappy in a way because they were seeing the Mouride still be some kind of a question mark. Who really are they? What are they doing? And they have this vision, this bucolic vision of African farmers built around the Serer, and they definitely created, which is absolutely not true, but nevertheless it's very true in their mind, and they have policies, they acted on it, that the Mourides were threatening the Serer. So they have to defend the Serer. In this particular case, we talk about the Saloum. Elsewhere, it is to defend the Jola, for instance. In some other parts, it was to protect the Fula of the Upper Gambia River against the Mouride. So there is this paranoia that the Mouride will, how to put it, contaminate those population, and more militant, and therefore they design policies to try to avoid the penetration of the Mouride Dara into those areas. And another point now, but paradoxically, what would happen is actually the French will end up being quite, how to put it, on the side of Mouride. Well, first of all, every administration is really geared toward producing numbers. If you produce 10 this year and you produce 15 the next year, and then you produce 20 the following year, administration is happy. In all world system, that's how at least the mentality is. And since the economic growth was incredible, I mean, that it wasn't expected. At some point, the French sat down and say, well, wait a minute, maybe we're getting it all wrong. And one example, or at least one case, make them discover that they got it all wrong. It is the settlement of Saint Bassirou Mbacké around Kaolack. When Saint Bassirou Mbacké settled around Kaolack, there were so many complaints by the local French traitants and administrators that they're going to overwhelm the area, they're going to occupy the land, and they're going to move down south into the Seine, etc., etc., etc. But the establishment of Saint Bassirou was quite successful, not just in the groundnut system, but it provided Kaolack and other smaller cities with what was missing, and allowed actually for the French population to settle a little bit more for their activities, commercial, political, administrative, or other. It started to provide this kind of a green belt around the Senegalese cities. In other words, producing cabbages, tomatoes, etc., etc., being active in providing for everyday food staple that growing cities need. It was through the establishment of that green belt around Kaolack that the local administration started to look at a bigger picture of what the Mouridism was, and how the Dara is not just a rural kind of clearing, slash and burn, destroying trees, planting groundnuts and moving ahead the next generation to a new place after they depleted one particular place. This kind of a new urban economy that allowed for areas like Bustan, for instance, in Kaulak, to be able to allow for those cities to literally survive and to have a future instead of just being limited in the size of their population because of a lack of availability of food staples. And around that time, the administration discovered that actually it wasn't just slash and burn, destroy the environment and move further south or further east, depending on the area we're talking about. But actually, that those communities, when they started to do studies, they discovered that actually the Murid were not exclusively producing groundnut. Actually, they produced more food staple like millet than they produced groundnut. So the whole picture of the Murid hungry of producing groundnut get restated and actually questioned even by the French colonial administration, which by the turn of the mid-1930s started to say, well, wait a minute, maybe we should look at, in a little bit more detail how this community grows. And that's when they discovered that actually instead of depleting, especially the food staple and the food stock of the local communities, actually the Murid were first about producing food, being able to sustain themselves from years and years and years, especially when there is a drought, that because of those drought-prone areas. And it's only after they establish themselves as being viable in terms of food stuff that actually they engage in groundnut farming. And that was a huge surprise of the 1930s. I'm going to stop here.
Okay, if time permit, maybe